Good evening. How many of you ever had the right answer but still stayed silent? Can I see some hands go up? Awesome. Now keep your hands up. How many of you did not really know as to why you stayed silent? Beautiful. And that the gap between knowing that you had something to speak, but you really did not share or you really chose to stay silent. So that's exactly what this talk is all about. What do you think we call this gap as? We attribute this to fear, we call it lack of commitment, we call it lack of opinions, we call it lack of ideas. We think people need to be brave, they need to speak up, they need to show up. But what if fear isn't the problem at all? What if it is something else? Why do we keep attributing things to fear or lack of ideas or lack of opinion? I come from engineering background. I am an engineer, and there is a ruthless rule in everything that we do. Never ever solve a problem that has been clearly defined. And when you break it, you're going to fail silently and expensively, right? So why do you think we have this ruthless rule? And what shocks me the most is I see quite often than not that we tend to break this rule everywhere, right? In personal lives, in professional setup, and in every place that you go, you can see a lot of us breaking this rule. And that I think is not because we don't know what to say or we don't know what to speak. And I think that is because we need to address the most important elephant in the room, which is confusion. Only at that moment when confusion drops, clarity emerges, right? And I have been in rooms full of articulate, smart people. I've seen them choose to stay silent. Despite of the crucial conversations that's going on, I've seen them stay silent. I don't think it was because of lack of ideas, or I don't think it was because of lack of courage. They chose to stay silent because the questions kept shifting. The goal was implicit, and the success criteria, it was never stated, right? Speaking isn't bravery in that kind of an environment. It's just guesswork, and then so the most articulate people chose to stay silent, and then they just moved on. So what is it that you think we could do for us for this clarity to emerge? Even before I get into the space, at least based on my experience, what I've seen is there are 3 different blockers that actually prevents clarity from emerging. The most important one is the unnamed assumptions, right? People get to speak. We can sit across each other and we can just talk about different topics. Like, for example, one person can talk about 30 minutes for solving problem, and the other person wants to actually be visible and be heard. But after 30 minutes, if they're not going to explicitly state and say that, hey, here's what I want out of this conversation, they're going to deliberately fail, right? So the most important, or the number one thing that we would have to address is this unnamed assumption. We'll have to be explicit, and we'll have to be loud and clearly state what is it that when we start this whole conversation. And our brain basically gets into a predictive processing mode. It is not willing to actually accept what reality is, right? And it tries to predict outcomes, and then when reality unfolds, it matches it with the predictions. So we cannot train or we cannot test a model that we've never tested with prior inputs, right? And I can apply the same logic to this whole thing. So no unnamed assumptions. As much as we can be explicit and state what those assumptions are upfront. And removing that would be the number one thing for us to move towards clarity. What is the number 2 thing in here? Wrong problems. The loudest problems in the room always may not be the most real or the most right problem for us to solve, right? But when you are in that situation, you tend to feel that you're solving the right problem, the room is built for it, and you have like n number of people around you who thinks that the problem is right, and you don't have a choice but to solve for it. And even if there's one person who thinks there's something off and this is not the right problem, they won't be able to name it because the brain kind of gets fixed into it, and they kind of get stuck in that mode till they actually get to name the or see the right problem. I've heard of a beautiful thing, right? So Einstein used to sleep with a silver spoon on his hand, and he'll be holding that over a metal plate. And just between this silver moment, right? So when he transitions from the awakened state to the sleep state, is when the spoon falls down and it clanks, and then he wakes up. And that's when magical insights emerge, right? So sleep in itself is not magical, but what's more important is the conscious grip that you have on things that you know, right? The moment brain lets go of that, it gets into a pattern recognition mode. And in neuroscience, people call this as hypnagogic state, where, brain kind of tends to analyze or recognize patterns, distant patterns that it never saw, because it always goes by rationale and logic, and what was completely impossible would magically surface in that specific state. And it's quite important for us to come back to reality because the conscious working memory is on, and so he used to write those magical insights, right? So the reason I say this is because the spoon falling moment is when we tend to realize that we are solving the wrong problems and we are addressing the wrong things in the room. And that's the most important thing for us to get one step closer towards clarity. And the third and the most important one, at least in my view, that if you're not going to solve for it or talk about it, then there's no way that we can get closer to clarity, right? And that is unacknowledged trade-offs. Clarity demands us to be willing to state what is okay for us to lose, right? And ambiguity lets us thrive in an environment where, we are okay with keeping things kind of vague and not willing to explicitly call out all the trade-offs. And that's quite uncomfortable, right? So just take the example of parents, right? So even with my own child, I want them to be free, and at the same time, I want them to be independent, and I want them to be safe, right? So being free requires lesser control, whereas if I want safety, then it means a little bit more control. And if I'm not going to say out loud in terms of what I choose, my child is going to grow in ambiguity, not knowing whether he's being managed or whether he's trusted. And most of the people choose to stay in this kind of a tension or friction, and that's primarily because they don't want to lose anything, and they want to deliberately keep things vague. So what is the brutal truth? Most people, at least in my experience, I see they avoid clarity not because it's hard, but because clarity ends negotiations. I repeat, clarity ends negotiations. So when things are like absolutely clear, you cannot hide behind intentions, you cannot hide behind excuses, you cannot hide behind, hey, I have the right intentions, I've put in so much efforts, and I couldn't get there because of the unacknowledged trade-offs. There's no way that you can hide behind anything because everything is crystal clear. You know what you're willing to lose, you know what's important, and so there's no more scope for negotiation, right? And when that kind of an exceptional clarity arrives, that's when transformation begins, right? Voices are not bound by fear, or voices are not bound by asking, we think if people are motivated and if we ask them to speak up, we think their voices will unbound. But the true revelation actually happens in those silent moments when we sit down and understand why we stayed silent, why we chose to solve for the wrong problems. What did we do when those trade-offs were put in front of us? What were those assumptions that we failed to name, right? Those moments of silent realization is when voices truly reveal, right? When that kind of a clarity arrives, it's beautiful because speech is no more about expression. It's all about alignment, right? You tend to speak because something has become so obvious. There's not anything that's being hidden or that's not very clear, and everything is outright there in front of you, and so we don't have a choice but to speak. And when that happens, voice is unbound, right? You can apply this to any walks of life, be it professional, personal, or any kind of an organization. And knowingly or unknowingly, the environments that we live in or that we thrive in, they are designed to reward for fast answers and skip those hard questions that actually make it possible for people to get those great answers out, right? So I all want you to think about it, like at least for a second. Environments that are designed to reward fast answers, environments that don't allow people to ask all those hard questions and make way for those great answers, right? That's the kind of environment that we all live in, whether or not we like it. Most of the rooms are like that. And so we don't have a choice but to consciously be aware of all those impediments that is not going, that lies between us and clarity, right? And so here's what I want to leave you all with. Like I mentioned, voices do reveal when confusion drops. Voices do reveal when clarity arrives. Until we are willing to honestly investigate the situation, honestly willing to go through what is actually happening, right? It's not about what we assume is happening. It's not about what we think may happen, but what is actually happening. That honest investigation has to start. Till we get there, confusion prevails. And when confusion prevails, obviously silence would be the most intelligent and rational response in the room, right? So we should attack those unnamed assumptions and we should challenge those unacknowledged trade-offs. And we should really, really think multiple times to see if we are solving the real problems, because the wrong ones appear to be easy and we kind of get carried away solving for them. And the more and more we get to challenge these, more and more we get to realize this is when clarity arrives. And so, at least in my view, the question isn't what do we do to make people speak up? But perhaps the question is, what confusion are we maintaining to ensure silence continues to be the most intelligent and rational response in the room? Thank you.